this space, it is our collective responsibility to respect and regard this land as being traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the United First Nations and to demonstrate our respect as we gather here this weekend and call our connections. So I am Kate Bester, and I'm going to welcome Lennon, and will be speaking to us about I Don't Know More movement from Red Power to I Don't Know More. So she'll speak for about 34 minutes, and then there'll be time for discussion.
Thanks, Kate. Most of the talk will actually be on the Red Power movement, because I'm not sure how many people will either remember it or want their memory refreshed around some of the key events from that day. And at the very end, I'll do a bit of a comparison with I Don't Know More. And I apologize, I'm going to be reading a lot of historical stuff, so I didn't want to get it wrong. A former member of the American Indian movement looked back at the days of Red Power and said, "I didn't think of it as a string of successes at the time, but I guess that's what it was. It was a time when you questioned things, when what you hadn't really thought about became pretty obvious. It was a time when you could make a difference." So Red Power stands for Mass United Militant Action. It's just as important to know about and learn from the Red Power movement as the Civil Rights Movement, Women's Liberation Movement, any of those movements from the 1960s or any other period. Red Power, like Black Power, set off a wave of action and a level of consciousness in both Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities, and that has stayed with us. But before we get to the parallels or contrasts between Red Power and I Don't Know More, let's take a look at some of the key events of the older movement, the international context in which it took place, and some of the debates that took place back then, as well as the legacy that was left behind. Most scholars date the movement as roughly between 1969 and 1978, covering events that took place in North America. I'll leave it to another time to research and explore what was going on in other Indigenous communities around the world at that time. Of course, no movement develops out of thin air, nor does it disappear without a trace. The list of injustices that faced Indigenous people in the 1960s was even longer than it is today, if you look at that. The lives of Indigenous people, both on and off reserve, were, and still are, dominated by the results of colonization, poverty, lower levels of health and education. But there was also a cultural spirit that was never extinguished, and a strong sense of justice betrayed. So why did the Red Power movement arise during the late 1960s and not earlier? Were there specific events that made that movement imperative? We know that huge historical movements often begin with a small spark, an event that in and of itself seems quite minor. But in the case of the Red Power movement in Canada, the spark was actually something much more public and sweeping. The precipitating event was the federal government's release of its, quote, Statement of the Government of Canada on Indian Policy, or what was called a white paper, which is actually named with policy papers when they're in draft stage, etc., for discussion. In June 1969, the Indian Affairs Minister was Jean Coutin under the Trudeau government. This document sought to extinguish all distinct status for First Nations, the very status guaranteed under existing laws. The white paper would have been the death knell of distinct First Nations cultures and rights, as paltry as these rights were and are under the Indian Act. But as the First Nations writer James Burke noted, with a long quote here, given all this level of injustice, one would think that the Indian special status is more of a millstone than a crutch. Not from the Indian standpoint, though, for poor housing is better than no housing, inadequate education is better than no education, and inferior medical care is better than no medical care. But there's more to it than that. There's the land upon which thousands of Indian people reside and believe to be theirs, as well as other vast tracts which they claim belong to them due to treaty or aboriginal rights. Without land, Indians would be unable to sustain the idea of native nationhood. As they would put it, where there's land, there's hope. Hope for independence, both cultural and economic. The assimilation goal that underpinned the White Paper represented a continuation of long-standing policy of the Canadian state that you're familiar with, starting with the Indian Act, residential schools, adoption scoop, etc. But Red Power was already evident in Canada before the release of the White Paper. In March 1969, at a conference of the Manitoba Indian and Métis Conference, Jeanette Corbière, who was from Toronto, actually stated, "The only way to gain equality is not to ask for it, but rather to lay claim on it. We will not only rock the boat, we will sink it if need be. What is striking about the Red Power era, and what distinguished it from other periods of Native resistance, because there has always been Native resistance, is the frequency of actions taken and the direct action focus that they used, as opposed to lobbying efforts, which was the main tactic, not the only one, but the main tactic used previously. I'll just go through some of the key events that happened. In January 1970, 200, as they called themselves at that time, Indians and Métis, occupied the Alberta New Start Centre in Lac-La-Biche because the government had cancelled its research programs. The summer of 1973 saw a lot of activity, including the occupation of the Office of Department of Indian Affairs in Ottawa and in Kenora, Ontario, northwestern Ontario, between Thunder Bay and Winnipeg. Cache Creek, BC saw highway blockades to protest poor housing on reserve. In October, hundreds of Mohawks fought police and smashed windows of band council offices on the Kahnawake Reserve. Quotes like the Sioux at Wounded Knee, the Mohawks of Kahnawake considered the reactionary tribal council were as great an enemy as the oppressive socioeconomic institutions of the dominant society. But 1974 was seen by some as the turning power in the Red Power movement in Canada. One of the key events was the occupation of Anishinaabe Park in Kenora, Ontario again. Lewis Cameron from the nearby White Dog Reserve had organized a conference in the park, but participants decided they needed to do more to assert their rights and make their demands heard. This occupation was the first time in this period that First Nations people would actually use arms to increase pressure to ensure their rights. The occupation lasted 39 days, involving a standoff of about 100 First Nations people, including members who come up from the States from the American Indian Movement and police. It originated with a group within those at the conference. An Ojibwe group said the park had been wrongfully taken from them by the city of Kenora 10 years earlier, to whom it had been sold by the federal government without Ojibwe permission. But the July conference created an atmosphere to articulate other demands. And I know I could give a lot of these that Ron Plain and John got it yesterday. An end to police harassment in Kenora, better medical and dental services, removal of a particular judge, I'm not sure who was the ancestor of Ron Plain's judge, creation of a police college for First Nations people, and cultural training for non-Indigenous people, police especially, creation of a local human rights committee, appointment of First Nation justices of the peace. First Nations were armed with rifles and had Molotov cocktails, vowing to, quote, kill or be killed. At one point, a smaller group of 50 to 40 threatened to destroy buildings downtown if police hurt the participants. The event involved Kenora police and 150 RCMP and OPP, but ended when protesters left the park after 39 days. There were dozens of arrests, but subsequent acquittals. The leaders of the main national First Nations political bodies spoke out against the action as condoning violence. But the next main event that year in 1974 took place on Parliament Hill, right after Anishinaabe. The event was planned as a demonstration to raise awareness of the plight of Indigenous people. To build support, Lewis Cameron again, leader of the Ojibwe Warrior Society, end of the occupation, went around Canada and launched the Native People's Caravan. And he succeeded in getting about almost 1,000 people to go to march to Parliament Hill. There were lines of police with bayonets and tear gas, so the usual shitstorm ensued. A variety of militant groups emerged from that as well, especially in urban settings. For example, there was something called the Toronto Warrior Society and the Native Alliance for Red Power, which was on the West Coast. One member of the Toronto Warrior Society, Vern Harper, I have my old newspapers with me, but an interview with him here, went on to run for a Maoist party that ran in the Rosedale riding in a federal election that year. But there were ongoing Indigenous struggles that came to a head during this same period. As you may have talked about in other sessions, the end of the 1960s marked the end of the post-war boom, and what was called the oil crisis of 1970-71 was really only another crisis in the international economy. And as we know, when the economy is in crisis, the corporations get even more aggressive than normal in their search for profits. And in Canada, that meant looking for new sources of oil, gas, and electricity, and it led to head-on collisions with a number of First Nations communities. The most famous examples were the James Bay Cree and Inuit resistance to the flooding of the rivers that go to James Bay, and the other was the fight of the Dene people against the Mackenzie Valley Pipeline in the Northwest Territories. You're going to hear that word a few times. The government planned to put in a pipeline for the Canadian Arctic Gas Pipeline and the Foothills Pipeline Limited, met with fierce resistance from the Dene people in the Northwest Territories, and created popular and working class support. So the government, of course, wanted to de-escalate things. So what did they do? They set up a commission headed by Tom Berger. The Dene resistance arose in response to the process of that, and to the fact that they had a land claim of some 400,000 square miles in the area. The Northwest Territories Indian and Métis Federation stated it would use any means necessary, a term popularized by Malcolm X, to defend the claim. In 1975, they called for independence and self-determination within the country of Canada. Interesting, this struggle evinced considerable support from the Canadian population. As described in one sympathetic newspaper, probably one of these, Native activists have also sought support from organized workers and northern whites who are concerned about the land and the environment. In a most significant development, the Oil, Chemical, and Atomic Workers Union and the United Auto Workers Union have taken a stand in favor of a just land settlement before the pipeline is built. Another major energy-driven struggle was undertaken by the First Nations people, as I mentioned, around the rivers leading into James Bay, where the James Bay Energy Corporation was diverting major rivers to create hydropower for export to the United States. The managing company was Bechtel, which is kind of known internationally for ignoring communities and getting the resources that they want. So I want to take a look at the international, sort of the North American context for Red Power. The initial response to Chrétien's white paper was the initial defining moment of the Canadian movement. One of the first major acts of rebellion in the United States to catch attention was the occupation of Alcatraz Island near San Francisco in the same year, 1969, the same year that the white paper was released. The occupying group was called the Indians of All Tribes, and as one historian has described it, the occupation and the Red Power Indian activist movement that followed in its wake took their places alongside the Civil Rights Movement, the Black Power Movement, the anti-Vietnam movement, Vietnam War movement, and the many other movements dramatizing the grievances of and demanding rights for women, Latinos, Asians, gays, the poor, and the disabled. As early as June 1961, representatives from more than 60 tribes met in Chicago and issued what they call a Declaration of Indian Purpose. And growing out of this was the National Indian Youth Council, NIYC, of young, again, mainly urban Native activists. It was one of the first Native activist organizations formed during the Civil Rights era. Native people adapted the Civil Rights sit-ins, as you might have heard about, to what they call fish-ins, mainly in the Pacific Northwest. These consisted simply of fishing so-called illegally in waters traditionally used by Native people, and the precipitating events were court restrictions on Native fishing. Fish-ins took place mainly in Oregon and Washington states and drew upon both local First Nations as well as national Native activist organizations. The fish-ins resulted in legal victories, but equally important organizational lessons, a veritable training ground for future Red Power activists. The lessons included learning the importance of alliances between local tribal groups and national organizations. Secondly, attracting media attention to influence popular opinion and the courts. But the turning point for the Red Power movement came, as I mentioned earlier, with the 1969 occupation of Alcatraz Island. The occupation was seen as a turning point because the event was led not by local tribes, but by a national or supra-tribal organization. In this case, it was called the Indians of All Tribes. The other reason it was considered a turning point was because activists began targeting urban centers and national monuments or property as what they were calling surplus government land that belonged to Indigenous people. The occupation of Alcatraz began with just over 80 Indigenous activists in November of '69. Due to the high level of political consciousness that had developed around the world by 1969, there was tremendous solidarity with the occupation. Quote says, most of the non-Indians of the nation gave them, the activists, their sympathy and support, and the government, not wishing to provoke a confrontation, let them stay. San Franciscans sent them food, medical supplies, and other assistance. Tourists ferried to the island to give words of encouragement, and enthusiastic Indians from reservations and urban areas came to live there temporarily or or permanently. Why the sympathy? It was because of the successes of battles fought by other minorities, African American, the Vietnamese abroad, and the awareness of the hypocrisy of government policy. The Native activists also drew in celebrities like Dick Gregory, Marlon Brando, who refused his Oscar that year, Johnny Cash, and Buffy St. Marie. The Alcatraz occupation lasted 19 months. The impact was electric and widespread. One of many quotes from the time includes, "Every once in a while, something happens that can alter the whole shape of a people's history. This only happens once in a generation or lifetime. The big one was Alcatraz." A year earlier, in 1968, the American Indian Movement, or AIM, was formed in Minneapolis, Minnesota. It was inspired by the Black Panthers and was set up to address similar problems: police harassment, racism, and poverty. It had its strongest bases in urban settings, but quickly became known on large reserves across the States and Canada. Some of the best-known names you might know are Russell Means, Dennis Banks, and Leonard Peltier. Leonard Peltier in Canada, but the States, Leonard Peltier. If Alcatraz was the galvanizing event for the Red Power movement in the United States, then AIM, the American Indian Movement, became the movement's best-known legacy. The initial occupations by AIM were usually short-term, a few days, and also had a cultural and celebratory aspect. Russell Means and AIM organized what they called the capture of the Mayflower II on Thanksgiving in 1970. They briefly occupied Mount Rushmore in 1971. There was also an important event called the Trail of Broken Treaties. Again, a caravan, similar to what happened in Canada, of Indigenous activists from across the country to the Federal Bureau of Indian Affairs, as it's called in the States, to that building in Washington, immediately prior to the presidential election. But in the early 1970s, there began to be a shift from those supra-tribal events to issues more rooted in specific communities, and AIM refocused from the urban centers to the reservations. And there was also a shift to the longer-term occupations, as was the case with Alcatraz. The most famous of these was at Wounded Knee in the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota, which was the place of the U.S. massacre of the Lakota Sioux in 1890. And the event also magnified tensions inside the Native community itself. The conflict in Wounded Knee was related to the internal divisions in the Oglala Lakota Sioux tribe over its chair, a fellow named Richard Wilson, who some saw as corrupt and totally co-opted by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. There were two opposing camps, and Wilson's opponents, supported by AIM, came from outside Wounded Knee. They led a siege that lasted 71 days. Again, they were armed. There were shootouts, roadblocks, resulting in the deaths of 2 Indigenous activists and federal FBI forces. Richard Wilson remained as chair. Subsequent tribal-based occupations occurred in 1974 and 1975. They were varying, lengths, but many, many states had them: New York, Wisconsin, New Mexico, South Dakota, Washington. By 1975, there was a shift again. AIM began to make a priority of establishing or strengthening connections with Indigenous peoples internationally, leading to an AIM offshoot called the International Indian Treaty Council. So what were some of the debates that happened within the Red Power movement at that time? Certainly one was about tactics, and we know that always comes up in all of our movements. One objection to AIM, for example, was that it was not sufficiently rooted in the local communities in which it was wanting to have occupations, for example, and that made them lose some credibility. And disagreement about tactics was somewhat related to generational differences. And some felt there was a lack of inclusion. They didn't feel that AIM folks coming from the outside were inclusive enough of the local people. I would have been glad to join them, said somebody, but they didn't ask us. It's a person from the Northern Cheyenne Reservation. In Canada, there was also a debate, I don't want to overplay this, but it was a real debate at the time between First Nations men and women. As you may know, First Nations women had been discriminated against under the Indian Act, where if a First Nations woman married a non-Indigenous man, she would lose her Indian status under the Indian Act and the paltry benefits, but at least there were some benefits there. But if a First Nations man married a non-Indigenous woman, he was able to retain his status. And so she began an action in 1974 that went on for a long time, but at the time, there were those, it says, including the majority of chiefs and Indian associations, who favored the status quo, and on the other were women's rights groups and the Native women who had lost their Indian status through marriage, with the latter faction, the women, advocating reforms which would enable Indian women to enjoy the same rights and privileges as Indian men. But this particular struggle was eventually won, but not until 1985. There were also debates between kind of grassroots organizations and those that were funded by government. We see that happening again as well today. And then within the Native communities, there were also some very conservative thinkers. A lawyer named William Watuni from Alberta wrote a book called Ruffled Feathers, Indians in Canadian Society. And he actually agreed with those on the right that said the best way forward for Native people was assimilation. He supported the white paper and, not surprisingly, was called on by the federal government to speak at their events. Something you might be interested in knowing what the relationship was between Indigenous activists and other progressive forces in Canada at the time. Some Red Power activists were heavily influenced by nationalist struggles for self-determination that were going on in Africa and Vietnam at the time. And in their ideological explorations, many found that Marxist explanations made a lot of sense. Certainly Vern Harper, as I mentioned, was an active Maoist. And he wrote in 1974, one of the key factors that made 1974 a turning point was that Native activists, for the first time in their generation, realized that there was non-Native support for their cause. The isolation of the Natives, used by the states, is no longer effective. We see trade unions, progressive left groups, church groups such as the Quakers, even liberal elements, give support, such as funds, telegrams, we have telegrams, participating in demonstrations, letters to members of parliament, denouncing the tactics of the state to help us. There's a more militant and revolutionary theme emerging, which is beginning to get support from all elements of the Native movement. Native and non-Native people are seeing that capitalism doesn't serve the masses, it only protects the capitalist's interests. Another Native Marxist was Howard Adams from Saskatchewan. I think an issue or so ago, Socialist worker Evan Johnson wrote a pretty good piece on him. But in 1975, Howard Adams wrote, if Native organizations are not politically active on a regular basis, they cannot come together with non-Native people. It institutionalizes special status and gives a message to non-Natives that says, our problems are different from yours and our solutions are different. However, in fact, the problems are the same in the end. A small number of rich people get all the benefits of the capitalist society, and the vast majority, Native and non-Native, face constant insecurity and poverty. How did the NDP fit into all this? You probably have Thomas Mulcair on your minds. So, Native people and non-Native people had lots of hope whenever the NDP was elected. We still see that. In 1972, the NDP was elected for the first time to head up the provincial government in BC. So Premier Dave Barrett, who's seen as a real lefty firebrand, appointed a First Nations leader, Frank Calder, to the cabinet, but gave a minister without portfolios. He had really no real authority. It was a real token gesture. That same kind of duplicity, and I'm sure there's other examples, but one of them was shown by the NDP in Manitoba. Remember how I mentioned how the government had set up the Berger inquiry to try to de-escalate things around the Mackenzie Valley pipeline? And when the inquiry was making its rounds and was in Winnipeg, the NDP declined to make a submission. Because from their own logic, they felt they were between a rock and a hard place. They knew if they supported the pipeline, they'd be unpopular with Native people and a lot of non-Native people. But if they spoke out too loudly against the pipeline, they would be hypocritical, because that kind of opposition would fly in the face of their own behavior towards Native people through their own support of hydroelectric projects in northern Manitoba and forced relocations. So there were a lot of challenges faced by the Red Power movement, just trying to keep up any kind of pan-Canadian or pan-continental organization is always difficult. As I say, we've got a little vacillation from the NDP and from the labour movement to a certain extent. And there was not a lot of history of a pan-Canadian organization at that time, and as debates around tactics. But there was a tremendous positive legacy left behind as well. For one thing, they understood that the Native bureaucracy can be almost as big a problem as the oppressor government. And there's an interesting quote here. At a Native Brotherhood meeting I attended in 1974, I was struck by the tremendous faith in proper procedure. The meeting was more a ritualistic ceremony in praise of Robert's rules of order than a forum for debate. The natives were so preoccupied with procedure and ritual that discussion on serious social and political issues never arose. They could not relate to each other as people. This is the result of counseling by white advisors and by those native collaborators who want to imitate sophisticated, so-called white leaders. Such meetings are useless because they smother rather than develop political and national consciousness. Native people must be perceptive enough to recognize when they're being led down blind alleys by their oppressors, red or white. So that was one legacy of understanding. Another one was the strength that many people understood that the links between their oppression and corporate greed, even if there wasn't always a conscious anti-capitalist awareness. Number of victories. The government had to withdraw the 1969 white paper. That was a huge victory. But there were lots of concrete gains in services, particularly in the area of education, both in the terms of number of schools that began to be funded, especially on reserve, and the content of the curriculum that began to emphasize Native studies right up to the post-secondary level. They also increased, the government was forced to increase funding for social programs. Still not to what it should be, but it was a step forward. But the most important legacy was showing the confidence to resist in vocal, visible ways, due to the frequency of activity and the volume of activity and the type of activity, especially the direct action, the assertion, and not just lobbying and court efforts. The significant strengthening of Indigenous peoples internationally, as we know, continues to this day through a number of international initiatives, and we'll talk in a minute about I Don't Know More. So of course it's very early days to be comparing, I Don't Know More with Red Power movement, but we're going to try it anyway. Some of the differences. I think the public face of I Don't Know More is much more female than was the case with Red Power. Obviously there were leaders, women leaders in Red Power like Anna May Aquash, but the public face predominantly tended to be male, as it was for many of the other movements of the day. And really, you can see the change of big movements becoming more women, really going back to 1999, early 2000s with Naomi Klein, Aaron Danny Roy, Maud Barrow, Vendetta Shiva. But in the case of I Don't Know More, they're really into their own matriarchal society and whatnot. So that's one difference. Another one is that there's probably more unity in First Nations community between men and women. I mentioned during the 1960s and 70s there was that debate around getting married, losing status, etc. That's long gone, and you'll certainly see activists today, male activists in I Don't Know More, being quite comfortable, quite proud of women leadership. While both movements had a level of support from non-Indigenous people, I think it's fair to say that I Don't Know More have really explicitly and consistently reached out to non-Indigenous people and seeing that as a positive way forward. And when you go to I Don't Know More events, you certainly see a good proportion of non-Indigenous people there. First Nations people I've spoken to say they've been pleasantly surprised by how many non-Aboriginal people have come to those events, that they weren't expecting that. Another difference was that there were a few unions for sure who spoke out in support of some of the Red Power campaigns, but I think there's much more explicit and immediate union support for I Don't Know More. We saw that, in November, December, when Cup W wrote a fantastic letter to Harper in support of the claim of I Don't Know More. Right out of the get-go, Canadian Auto Workers and a few others, and shortly thereafter, the Canadian Labour Congress issued statements of support. So that's certainly a difference. And I think, again, it ties into the demand that I Don't Know More is making around environmental issues, for example, that pull in all Canadians. Obviously, there was a difference in ways of communicating because of the technology that was available. So after the meetings, I kept low these many years papers that actually I helped to type some of these ones, but they had newspapers that they used it for communication. Does anybody know what a Gestetner machine is? You can tell your age, yeah. So we.
I'm very young.
Yeah. I don't know if there were photocopy machines in those days. So the Gestetner machine, well, we'll tell you after. Anyway, that was a way of copying your written material and making handouts. So now, of course, we have Twitter and Facebook, and Idle No More is making fantastic use of those things. So obviously that's a difference. Also, Idle No More is kind of it originated in Canada, whereas Red Power was very much a North American movement. But I would say more American-led. I'd also say that the nature of international solidarity is somewhat different, and that was just kind of my impression. But Ron Plain kind of confirmed it yesterday that that the level of international support for Idle No More is much more broad, frequent, and out there, and easy to promote through Facebook and Twitter than was the case with what was going on with Red Power. But let's look at some of the similarities. Unfortunately, the basic demands are the same, having to do with not only control of lands and resources, but running their own governments, reclaiming their authority, which is kind of depressing for the amount of time that's gone by. The Royal Commission has happened, Oak has happened, Gustus and Lake, and other forms of resistance. So that's unfortunately one similarity. Another similarity was that in Canada, at least both movements that had their genesis with federal government legislation. It was the White Paper in 1969, and in 2012 it was the Omnibus Bill C-38 and the C-45, the Navigable Waters Thing. With both movements, we see the ambivalence of the NDP. I mentioned, in BC NDP in 1970, in Manitoba, they're waffling. And today we have Thomas Mulcair feeling just fine about some of the tar sands coming east, suggesting that Chief Spence and hunger strike, etc. Certainly, lots of individual members of the NDP extremely supportive and out there, but the leadership very, you see that same kind of waffle, it can undermine. In both movements, as in all social movements, we see debates around direct occupation, direct actions versus street demonstrations, that sort of thing. How far to press that? Although I would say with Idle No More, at least at the in their publications, they're really stressing peaceful activities, nonviolent activities. In both movements, we saw debates between grassroots activists and the formal leaders. We saw that in December around Assembly First Nations, were they going to meet with the Prime Minister or not, and lots of debates around that, and a real claim by grassroots activists that the AFN no longer represents them, etc. And you saw that with Red Power as well. On a really positive note, certainly both movements instilled and are instilling huge pride in Indigenous communities. And you really saw that at the round dances, if you went to any of those over the winter, and just that sense of, look at us. My mother, 95, when I took her to one, we went for coffee afterwards. I said, what did you think? She said, she replied, she said, well, everybody seems so happy. And, you go to a demonstration, who looks happy, right? But they look happy. Another similarity is that there were elements, and there are elements that are explicitly anti-capitalist. Certainly, the work of Ben Powell has spoken before. Lots of other explicitly anti-capitalist writers, and certainly that main similarity for us today is the need for socialists and all supporters to stand unequivocally in solidarity with First Nations against the onslaught of the Canadian state. Whether or not those struggles might be linked to a campaign that we're involved with, I would be supporting theirs. The international political context is similar. While the volume of activity, let's say around austerity and whatnot, is not as high today as it was in the 60s, the level of politics is very high. I think more and more people are aware of the root causes of the problems, lying with imperialism or capitalism, and more making connections between the different movements, not just parallel movements. Our response, as I said, has to be unequivocal solidarity, promoting the campaigns. It really is true that Idle No More and related Indigenous campaigns are providing the lead for all of us in terms of trying to save the planet. Thanks to social media, it is much easier to learn from Indigenous activists what they are saying and what they are organizing. Both Idle No More and a group called Defenders of the Land are calling for a summer of sovereignty. Next up is a call for a massive demonstration in Ottawa on June 21st, which is also National Aboriginal Day. So let's make this the hottest summer solstice ever. Thank you.